Hello, today's lecture is going to focus on photography. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of photography and how it's kind of made, as well as the significance in terms of art, etc. So if you'll remember, the last artistic movement that we looked at is realism. Okay, so there is an emphasis not only on depicting people realistically, but depicting everyday life, right? So think of Millet and the Gleaners, right? So depicting peasants, things that are not just beautiful or portraits of wealthy people, but everyday life. So that is kind of the context into which we enter photography. So photography is, it's during the Age of Enlightenment. So you have a focus on science and accurate documentation. You have the rise of the individual. And the term photography is coined in 1832. So it means light writing. So photo is light and graphy is writing. So prior to the 1830s, using light to fix images was, or alter images, I should say, was quite common. But the problem was that you could create one of these. So this is a photogenic drawing. That's what this is called. And so you would take a piece of paper or whatever your material, and you would coat it with certain chemicals, and then you would put something on it. Like here you see leaves, and put it out in the sun. But the problem was that those chemicals would deteriorate in the sunlight. So what you see here, the whiter areas are deteriorated, and you can see the leaves here. But the problem was, once you decided that you were done and you wanted to just have that image, there was no way to fix this image. So it would continue to deteriorate in light. So this was a really big problem. So the first surviving photograph is from 1826 or 1827. And this is what it looks like, a little bit cleared up and heightened. But this is what the original plate looks like. So this is une piste, and this is view from the window at Le Gras. So this is a pewter plate. So what you're looking at is a metal plate, and it's coated with bitumen of Judea, which hardens with exposure to sunlight. So it will be put in a camera obscura that's facing outdoors. And a camera obscura is an invention that has been around for a long time, and it is a precursor to photography as we know it. So what this involves is the use of light and a box with a pinhole, and then the image would enter the box and it would be inverted, and you could look at it, and this would help you kind of figure out how to set up your scene. So artists like Vermeer use a camera obscura. So basically how that works is you have this box, and light rays are reflected from a bright object to enter a small hole in that box, and then it produces the image. And it was in use as early as the 17th century as an aid for drawing. Okay, so, but again, right, you have this knowledge that you can use plates and mirrors to create these images, but the lack of knowledge on how to fix it so it would not continue to deteriorate in the light, etc. So this work is pewter, like I said, coated in a chemical, put in a camera obscura facing the outdoors, so it's looking out a window, and you can really see that here. You can see the town here, and the landscape, the horizon. And so after 8 hours, the artist dissolved any remaining bits of bitumen, the chemical that hadn't hardened with light exposure, and then exposed the plate to iodine fumes to increase tonal contrasts. And this created a positive image. So it did not create a negative, simply a positive. And this is a unique image produced without the aid of a negative. So photography, as we think of it now, if you get film, you can get the negatives printed, and then you can use those negatives to create as many positives as you want until the negative is worn out from use, right? But these are one-off images. So in 1839, so about 13 years later, the invention is finally announced to the public. And you have multiple people who are working on developing photography at the same time without talking to each other. So you have a lot of competition between people who are coming up with alternate forms of photography. And it's announced in the January at the Academy of Sciences in Paris, because photography requires a lot of science and chemistry. And so a man named Daguerre is credited with inventing a daguerreotype. Okay, and this is a daguerreotype, and I'm going to click on it. This is from 1853 to 54, and it was not taken by Daguerre. It is simply of the type that he invented. So like the view from the window that we just looked at, this is a unique image that is a positive, and it's printed onto a metal plate. So basically you have a copper plate that's covered with silver, and it's sensitized with iodine vapor. You place it in a camera obscura, then you take it out and you expose it to mercury fumes to bring out the image. Because the image is not visible until you expose it to the mercury, and then use table salt mixed with water to stop the sensitivity to light. And in January 1839, January 7th, it's presented to the public, and it is not patented. So basically, the French government gives Daguerre a pension because his work has contributed so much to humanity overall. And in return, his work is released to the public, and they know how to do it. So you should note that this image has been hand tinted, so it would be black and white otherwise, but I just want you to see how crisp this is. Okay, so this is a death portrait, which means that this woman is deceased. And so death portraits would be made of the deceased. This was not seen as a morbid or macabre sort of undertaking. This was a way of memorializing the deceased. And so you can see here the various elements of her dress. You can see just how crisp it is. And I want to highlight that because the next type of photograph that we're looking at is invented by William Henry Fox Talbot. And he develops his own method. And this is a calotype. And so calotypes are used to create negative, and you can create multiples. So it's a negative positive paper process. So you prepare paper with solution of silver nitrate, potassium iodide, expose it, and then fix it with more chemicals. So the daguerreotype is photography, but it's really the calotype that is the basis of modern photography until the digital age, because this is not a unique image, it is reproducible. And you can think of the photograph as a multiple, right? So we've seen multiples before in terms of prints, right? So making prints on paper, etc. But one thing that you can notice, and again, remember the detail that's visible here, because this is a positive and it is, sorry, cat. It's a positive and it is on metal, so it is very crisp. And you can see that with the calotype, the image sinks into the fabric of the paper and it's not as detailed. So they also didn't have a ton of chemical knowledge at the time. So this also affects the stability of the calotype. and these have a tendency to fade. So that's kind of the basics of photography, how it's invented, etc. So what we're going to look at is why and how it interacts with art. So this is an 1835 image, used camera obscura, and you can see that it is in fact very, Stasia, very faded. Sorry about that. So photography was kind of conflicted. So there were some who thought that it was too commercial to be an art form. It was seen as yet another facet of mass production, and it was seen as at odds with high culture, as well as a threat to imagination and creativity. And it was seen as being too scientific. So its role was going to be solely to document things and to take photographs of, say, a plant to publish in a book on botany. Okay. But art photographers think that it differs from commercial photography and that the commercial seeks to please a wide audience, but many see art photography as being based in moral or literary ideas. So they are going to set up scenes, similar to the way that a painter might stage a scene and then capture it in paint. You're seeing something similar, but with photography here. Okay. Just some really beautiful images that I wanted to show you. Fox Talbot does take a lot of still life images. These are very beautiful, and he came up with a few different ways of capturing information. So what we're seeing here is called the open door, and this is from April 1844. And this is actually related to Dutch genre paintings. So the images that we saw of Dutch interiors, people engaged in quiet occupations, etc. These are the sort of Dutch genre paintings that Talbot is imitating. And in 1835, that's when he realizes that his images could be used to make copies of the image. And then he later conceives of the negative and the positive. So you can see how this is artistic, right? You have the bright sunlight and the dark shadows. You have this invitation to let your eye wander into the background, etc. Okay, so just some other images by him. Okay, so again, documenting architecture, but not solely documentation. There's an artistic element included as well. And one thing that is worth pointing out is that when people start to create scenes of landscapes, etc., there's not necessarily the expectation that it is a completely factual landscape. So some of these are yes, so this is a great example. So this artist, Camille Sylvie, would take multiple photographs of a place and then splice them together in order to create a more a landscape more in line with what he wanted for his landscape. So again, and this was not seen as deceptive. There was not an expectation that this photograph would depict reality exactly as it is. Okay, so I am heading for Julia Margaret Cameron. So she starts photographing at the age of 49. She's given a camera in the 1850s or 60s, I believe. And it's a gift. She doesn't have an artistic background, and she starts to take photographs, and she's applying the aesthetic principles of painting to portrait photography. So what you see here is a woman with children, but this is not a portrait of a woman with her children. This is a Madonna with children, okay? So referencing the mother of Christ and the role of mothers, etc. She uses dramatic lighting, and she also tends to have, rather out of focus, slightly hazy, instead of the sharp focus. And she does this specifically for the artistic effect. So photography at this time meant strict adherence to the sharpness of detail. So Cameron was actually criticized heavily for ignoring the rules of photography. As I mentioned before, photography was not initially considered an art form. So this is Pomona, and I believe this is, yes. So this Pomona is a figure from literature, but the girl who is depicted here, her name is Alice Liddell. And interestingly enough, she's the Alice from Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. So she was his muse, and Lewis Carroll also dabbled in photography, and there are actually lots of photographs of her as a child naked being photographed by Carroll, which was common at the time, but it has significantly fallen out of favor since then because of the creepy element. But as I mentioned before, right, not considered an art form initially, it's used to capture likenesses of loved ones and famous figures. So again, right, capturing a loved one who has died so that you have something by which to remember them. And again, if this seems macabre, these are the same people who would take locks of hair and make wreaths and jewelry out of them. Victorian funerary processes are fascinating. And if you're at all interested in that, I would highly recommend that you look into it because it's a very interesting topic. So by 1841, your exposure time is down to 30 or 60 seconds, depending on the light, which is much faster than the 8 hours that we saw in 1826 for the view from the window. So you still need a device that would hold the head still because, right, even if you are standing still, there are still involuntary motions, and this would help your head to remain still because the exposure time is so long. And that's often why you don't see people smiling in these photographs because holding a smile for that long in exactly the same pose can be painful. Okay. So it's seen as an objective representation of reality. And then it plays an interesting role as documentation. So these are more Julia Margaret Cameron. And again, you can see the emphasis on the aesthetic as opposed to the documentary capabilities of photography. Okay. And you have people who are working on all sorts of tricks. So sometimes they photograph themselves as if they're dead, etc. So all sorts of ways that photography is being used. And you also have stereographs. So a stereograph is an image of a landscape, etc., that has been duplicated, and you would then put it onto a stereoscope, which is a device that you would peer into, and it would hold the two images at a distance from the viewing portion of the device. And when you look through the device, they would merge to become a 3D image of one thing. So this is a really, really neat invention at the time, a neat development with photography. I apologize, I changed the order, but it apparently didn't catch. So for the American Civil War, this is something that is starting to be used to share information more broadly. But for the American Civil War, this is the 1860s. And you still can't capture actual battles because of the long exposure time, but you can capture the aftermath of the battles. And viewers are understanding that what they're seeing is what the photographer would have seen on the field rather than a completely accurate depiction of how soldiers fell. So this is by Timothy O'Sullivan, and it's published in a larger book of photographs of the war. And this is titled Field Where General Reynolds Fell, Battlefield of Gettysburg, July 1863. And so what you're seeing here are the corpses of soldiers. But if you look at this image, and if you are at all familiar with war and how it is enacted at this time, you'll notice a couple of things that are odd here, specifically what is missing. Well, if you look at these people, you'll see that what's missing are shoes or boots. So basically, after the battle, you would have scavengers who would come to the field. And these are people who scavenge the dead bodies for anything that could be valuable. So at this time, shoes are valuable. They would remove any gold teeth. They would take any jewelry, watches, anything like that. And so we're seeing the aftermath of a battle, but it's after the scavengers have gone through. And you may notice that all of these men look quite portly. And the reason for that is that the decay process has already started. So they are starting to bloat from the gases of their bodies decaying. So this is a very staged photograph. He would drag the bodies to how he wanted them and then stage them. But this was, again, not seen as a journalistic failing, but this was an attempt to convey the feel, the effect of viewing the battlefield. And it is used to capture things like battlefields, as I mentioned. And again, right, you can see the same thing here. We have no shoes, the bodies are starting to bloat, okay? But again, this is considered acceptable. But you also see photography being used to document. And I'm gonna go back, sorry, bear with me. So at this time, we see the rise of social Darwinism. So social Darwinism is basically scientific wrapping around racism. So the idea is that you have Darwin's theory of evolution, right? So evolving from a lesser life form into mankind. And this was seen as being true of the various races of people on Earth. And basically the way that it was determined where you stood in this progression of progress towards the, the ideal human. So it's probably not hard to guess what this looks like. It's often based on skin color. And so at this time, this is scientifically accepted as people with darker skin tones are less evolved. Okay, and so photography was used to prove this. So what you're seeing here is 4 photographs of a man from, I believe, South Africa. Yes. And what you're seeing is measurements, right? So they would do things like measure the size of the skull, excuse me, and then use that to extrapolate the size of the brain, right? So the smaller your head, the less intelligence you have. If you have like a cranial bump, it means this, all sorts of things. And so what you're seeing here is the measurement of this man in order to prove that he is a lesser being. And so basically he's being treated like a science experiment. So you see this a lot in Africa. You also see it starting to be used for criminal justice purposes, so for purposes of identification. So what you see here is a table of features so that you can create a verbal portrait of a criminal, which is really interesting. So these ears are not necessarily identified as belonging to a specific person, but you would say, okay, so particularité fondue is the ear that I saw. And so you could create a verbal portrait in this way, kind of copy and paste, essentially, by putting this together, right? So see the forehead, all sorts of things are categorized. And so photography is really helping science. And it is also being used for criminal justice purposes, and it's also being used for more nefarious purposes, for scientific racism, like we talked about. And in instances where people were being photographed to prove that they were a lesser life form, they were actually told not to make eye contact with the camera, so that they wouldn't make eye contact with the viewer. You have standardized measurements, etc. And because you're using things like a camera, which is impartial, and because you're using things like measuring sticks and grids, these are seen as objective documentation. Okay. And you also see it to capture medical events, as well as starting to study how various elements of the face are involved in expression. And so what you're seeing here is this photographer would manipulate various nerves on the subject's face in order to create various expressions of emotion. Okay, so amazement, displeasure, right? And you can see that he's manipulating certain nerves, terror, etc. And so this was used to kind of help to categorize what various facial expressions looked like, etc. So again, right, it's being used for these purposes. It's also used for documentation. So what you see here is the 1897 punitive expedition to Benin City. And so you're seeing the colonizers, after they have racked and burned the palace, and they're taking booty back to England, i.e. they've stolen cultural treasures. So it is used for these purposes. And you also have Muybridge. So Edward Muybridge uses this as a tool for a scientific experiment, and he figures out how to take a succession of pictures to capture movement. So for the horses, he develops tripwires, right, that are activated, that activate a camera when the horse hits those. And so there's long been a question of, do all four hooves of the horse leave the ground when the horse gallops? And it's never been answered up until this point. And you can see that this horse is starting to gallop. And then here you can see all four hooves have left the ground. So Muybridge has proved that this is something that happens in a very scientific way. But again, he does engage in some manipulation in order to create these sequences of images. So again, you can see how this would be very useful to artists who want to engage in life drawing, etc. And this is absolutely used as an aid for artists as well as an aid for science. But some artists think that photography can't register the intricacy of human perception and emotion. Delacroix is one of those individuals, right? So you have a lot of conflicting views around photography. But again, right, you can see how this frame by frame documentation would be something very new. Again, right, movement, capturing that movement, scientific purposes. You also have individuals who are starting to use it specifically as artistic, right? So think about Julia Cameron, where it's a soft focus, it's very evocative, and critics think that this is straying too far from the descriptive capability of photography. So as I mentioned, it's used for documentation, and in 1880, we see the first photograph printed in a newspaper rather than an engraving, which is pretty revolutionary for the time. Okay, so that is kind of a rough overview of photography, how it works, as well as its significance to the art world, as well as science. So until next time.